Good morning. My name is Sean Pender, and I have the honor of being the National President of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Welcome today to another one of the AOH webinars. Today, our topic is immigration, and joining us today are our immigration chairman, Dan Dennehy, and the author of Unintended Consequences, the story of Irish immigration to the U.S. and how America's door was closed to the Irish, Ray O'Hanlon, and Ray, of course, of the our good friend from the Irish Echo. In 2009, Ray received one of the highest awards of the Ancient Order of Hibernians when he received the Sean McBride Award in Pennsylvania. I remember that event where Ray coined the term and called the AOH the brick and mortar of Irish America. I'm in the process right now of just about finishing this book, and I can't tell you how much I recommend it to all as a great source of not only on the Irish immigration process, but the story of how the Irish have been in the fabric of the United States from the times of George Washington, stories to Annie Moore, Duffy's Cut, and to the current day. So it's a very interesting book. And then when it gets into the politics and intrigue of the deals and everything else on Irish American immigration policy, it's even more interesting. So with that, Dan will facilitate the interview of Ray. And if any of our attendees out there have questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will feed them to Dan and Ray. Gentlemen, Ray, it's great to have you. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. Hi, everybody. Good morning to those that are watching live, and good day to everyone else. It's always an honor to serve the Ancient Order of Hibernians in any capacity, but to be the immigration chairman for the National Board brings us back to our origins, when the only way you could be a Hibernian would be as if you were an immigrant and you were living in the United States and you were Catholic. And at that time, they were formed in this country because there was a nativist, jingoistic, and non-anti-Catholic movement in the country. So the most recent New Yorkers and the most recent Pennsylvanians from Ireland were facing great strife and stress, and many of these people will live in abject poverty in Ireland. So following the foundation of this organization, we've always had an immigration chair, and we've always been committed to supporting fair and legal immigration to the United States. And for the last many years, since emigrating from Dublin, Ireland to the United States, Ray O'Hanlon has been an eyewitness to history here in the United States. He's been part of many historical events, and in writing the book Unintended Consequences, the story of Irish immigration to the United States and how America's door was closed to the Irish, this is a second part of a trilogy that Ray O'Hanlon has endeavored. This second completed part followed the New Irish, which was a book that was written by Ray about the wave of immigrants that came in the 1980s. This book not only picks up on that period of time and the Irish immigration, but it also gives us a comprehensive history of immigration as related to Ireland. And Ray is a very close friend to many of us in the Hibernian world, and sometimes I consider the Irish Echo to be our weekly source of information about each other across the country and in Ireland. So Ray, it's my great pleasure to have you on this webinar.
Thank you very much, Dan. And great pleasure to be with you all today at, I think, a moment that is very important in our nation's history. So delighted to be with you.
Well, Ray, you know, the big question that everybody struggles with is, how did we get here? And the other thing that's shocking when you deal with any legislator or many members of the Irish American community in particular is that the Irish aren't fully served by immigration services in the United States. And when they hear about people getting deported or people getting apprehended by currently ICE and Homeland Security, they automatically assume that these people are criminals, that there's a criminal element in our midst.
Mm.
And as people that work on this subject every day, I think we have a different perspective on it. And your book certainly offers the long and sad road that got us to where we are now. Now, there was many historical highs in this in this chronicle, but when we last focused on the 1965 Immigration Act, we were reckoning its 50th anniversary, and now, shockingly, in 2025, we're at its 60th anniversary, and most of us were alive when this happened, so it makes us considerably older than we thought we would be before a real Irish immigration reform would happen. So can you bring us back to a time when the Irish last had no problems with coming to this country and why it changed so radically?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say that the Irish have always crossed the Atlantic problem free. The first problem for the Irish was leaving home, and that was a problem. But they surmounted that. I mean, they had to, given the economic circumstances in Ireland for most of the 20th century. So problem one was saying goodbye, and problem two was saying hello and hoping that someone would say hello back. But of course, and I mean, if you go back to 1965, before that, maybe in the period after World War II, there was a significant movement across the Atlantic after World War II. We know that from all the stories. There was a generational shift, and there was a generation of Irish immigrants who became pivotal in the Irish American community in the years that followed. A number of them served in the Korean War. They would get jobs very often in sort of public service areas in the big cities. They would become stalwarts of Irish American organizations. That generation is passing away into history now. And unfortunately, there's no generation to replace them. And this is the problem now that we face in terms of looking back over Irish immigration. There was always succeeding generations and waves for negative reasons in Ireland, but we always say positive reasons here. I've always said the end of an old Ireland was the beginning of a new Irish America. And the reason for Irish America was the ending of things in Ireland. And that's not happening anymore. And it hasn't been happening pretty much since the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which politicians at the time were adamant in saying that it was not going to change anything, but in fact, it ended up changing everything.
Mm. And I think that one family comes to mind and gets a lot of scorn for their role in the legislation. And that family, of course, is a family that right before that time had had such a triumphant reunion with its Irish cousins in Ireland. I mean, the visit of the first Irish Catholic and Hibernian President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and his visit during his first term to not only his homeland, but also to his home village,
Yeah.
created a situation that was crystallized and almost put in amber by all of us, but yet it's still a very living thing for us to have the pride that we had in this president. And quickly, a lot of that that love that we had for him in some people's minds was replaced with a state of desperation and almost like negativity because the family name was associated with the 1965 Immigration Act. So if you could dance
Yeah,
around
no,
that.
obviously the Kennedys, if you look at the cover of the book, the photograph is of President Lyndon Johnson signing the act into law on Liberty Island in New York, October 3rd, 1965. It would take 3 years for the full force of the act to come into play. But as you see, as you're holding it up on the right side, as I'm looking at it, you see Robert Kennedy and you see Teddy Kennedy. And just off the frame on the other side, I believe, is Jackie Kennedy. Um, the act was a bringing to fruition of the wishes of President Kennedy. Now, when you look at the act itself, Um, it really is a very moral piece of work and in keeping with the spirit of the times. In and of itself, it wasn't a bad thing. And perhaps, yes, indeed, it was a time to end sort of quotas that favored some nations over the others and broaden the basis of immigration. But this is where, of course, what the intention was and what the effect was diverge. These are the unintended consequences. So the act itself, when you looked at it, you said, "Oh well, yes, it sounds very high-minded and altruistic and in keeping with the spirit of the times. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and so forth and so on." So Lyndon Johnson was effectively carrying into law the wishes of President Kennedy and his family. So it's hard, in a sense, to fault the act itself. It is what followed is where the fault lines begin to come into view. And very quickly after it came into full effect, and it's pointed out in the book, and it was noticed at the time by a group I'll mention in a minute, that Irish applications for visas literally fell off a cliff. In the month that it came into full effect, I think July 68, there were zero applications to come to America at the US Embassy in Dublin. Now, it may well have been that immigration was tailing. Irish immigration, as you know, would sort of peak and go down and up and down and up and down over the years, depending on economic circumstances in Ireland. Things were beginning to improve a little bit in the second half of the 1960s. And Irish politicians were determined and had indicated this to President Kennedy during his visit to Ireland that they wanted to sort of retain the population and not have young Irish people bailing out in large numbers to America or anywhere because they wanted them to be at home to meet the demands of a hopefully growing economy. So there were other circumstances in play at the time, but that number of zero really kind of stands out. And it was a foretaste of what was to come or what was not to come. And it led to the formation at the time of the American Irish National Immigration Committee, led by John Collins, Judge John Collins, Father O'Callaghan. And this was the first sort of group to stand up and as identify itself as an ad hoc group. There were others in the past, obviously. Um, and it was the very existence of this group that actually, when I thought of it, it prompted me to think, wait a minute, there's something about the number three groups over a period of a half century, AINIC, the Irish Immigration Reform Movement, or IRM, the Irish ILIR, Irish Lobby for Immigration Reform, and then you had the likes of Chicago Celts for Immigration Reform, and as I always say, a thread going right through the whole thing from start to finish, the ancient order of Hibernians ever present, and at times sort of commingling with the specific lobby groups because of the AOH members in those lobby groups and vice versa. So it was the beginning of a campaign to try and reverse not the intentions or the high intentions of the 65 Act, but the effects of the 65 Act. And that was, I suppose, the foundation for the book, the reason that I got the start of the book. Yeah.
Well, it's two observations from the actual photo and the setting of the signing by President Johnson and the witnesses that were there.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, Ted Kennedy did not remember being at the signing, and as you can see,
He doesn't know, and
he
that's in the
couldn't be
book.
closer.
Kennedy doesn't remember being there.
And the second thing is that obviously, even the greatest symbol of American welcome and immigration, the Statue of Liberty, had her back to this bill.
Yep.
They actually signed it with
to the right side of the back of the Statue of Liberty. Yeah. She's facing across the harbor, kind of looking east, and they were on kind of looking south on the right side of the back of the statue. I mean, yeah, that's just where the seat was and where the room was. But I suppose you can say over time that there was a symbolism built built into it. It's an interesting array of characters in that photograph, and there are more outside the frame. You know, and obviously the Kennedy brothers. You can see Avril Harriman in the background. Senator Daniel Inouye, just elected in Hawaii, is there as well. Lady Bird Johnson is there. Vice President Hubert Humphrey is there. I mean, that is an array that is as powerful as it got in America at the time.
Is
This was,
that Governor Wagner in the back?
I believe so, and I think Mayor Lindsay
Yes.
as
Yes.
well. Yeah,
Wagner was a Hibernian, by the way.
okay. Yeah. Um, yeah, you'd say it looks it's bound to be a Hibernian that lot. And of course, President Kennedy himself was a Hibernian. So no, I mean it was a major event. It was a big deal. That was not meant to be a big deal. This is the irony of it, and but it turned out to be an ever sort of a, a starting point for really a decline, I think, in the United States as a nation of immigrants, and certainly for the Irish. I mean, if you talk about the Irish as being like a canary in a coal mine, the canary was very quickly snuffed out within a matter of a couple of years. And then, you know, as you know, that didn't stop the Irish from coming. And certainly during the 1980s, you had a big movement west across the Atlantic of young Irish people in search of work. Most of them probably totally unaware of this event in 1965. I remember as a kid growing up in Ireland. I'm not old enough to remember President Kennedy, except I've seen him a million times in retrospect. But the first president who was on the TV on a regular basis was President Johnson in my childhood. Most of the time, it was to do with Vietnam, nothing to do with immigration. Um, but no, I mean, this is a starting point for, I guess, where we're at today. Where we're
Now,
at
Ray,
today goes right
yeah,
back to this.
right. Ray, you talked about this common thread of the ancient order of Hibernians. And sometimes I feel like Judge Collins because, you know, we are people that are concerned about the cultural exchange of our two communities. And we're constantly pointing out similar things, activists in immigration today, and Judge Collins and Father O'Callaghan, correct?
Yeah.
Now, Father O'Callaghan was I believe he's a past president of the Cork Association, as was Keating, who was one of the main activists on the immigration acts of previous years.
Hmm.
And he was also a chaplain, Father O'Callaghan, of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. So Cork and AOH and immigration seems to be another thread in this reform. Now, I know that Mayo men come very prominent in this mix as well. There was always an O'Dwyer, whether it was William O'Dwyer, the former mayor of New York, his brother Paul, or Paul's son Brian, who for 30 years led the Emerald Isle Immigration Center, and was also, I believe, a panelist with you when you were asking presidential candidates for the opportunity for Jerry Adams to get a visa to the United States, along with another Hibernian, Martin Galvin, who at the time was representing a different organization. But so this thread of Judge Collins to today, pointing out, for one thing, the Medal of Honor winners that Ireland has, twice as many as all other groups put together, the sacrifices that we did. And what was it like for 1965 for these two guys, Judge Collins, or future Judge Collins, and Father O'Callaghan, that what was it like for them to try and make impact? Because their words can echo today, and we want to get Hibernians and Irish Americans knowledgeable about what to say to their legislators. So what was their impact with the legislators?
Well, they very much played it through the system in terms of hearings and meetings and gatherings and sessions in Washington. I mean, they were, as I say, coming up against a view in Washington among legislators that really the new act wasn't going to change anything, that people would continue to come to America much in the same way as they did before. But their specific focus was on the Irish, and as I said, there was a cause and effect. There were changes in Ireland at the time, and then the effect of the act itself. And they could see very clearly, I think, what this was going to mean down the line a number of years. They were looking ahead more than they were looking. Obviously, they would employ, or they could argue, they could point to the extraordinary story of Irish immigration, what the Irish had done for America, going back to George Washington, more medals of honor than any other ethnic group, and so forth and so on. But I think they were looking ahead down the road to a situation where Irish America would begin to, I suppose, to be choked at the point of entry, because there would be literally few, if any, Irish people arriving legally in the United States. Judge Collins, being a judge, could read between the lines legally on this thing, I think, very quickly. I mean, he has it's like a book. His papers on which were made available to me on the workings of the AINIC, show very clearly that he could see the implications, present and future, for Irish immigration. And himself and Father O'Callaghan would attempt to argue this, but again, they were coming up against a kind of sympathetic legislators in Washington. But the flow at the time was very much with this bill, and the belief was that it's not really going to change things fundamentally anyway. So nothing changed. The arguments presented by AINIC were listened to, but not acted upon. So things moved on through the 1970s and 1980s, and then we reached into a new period in the 1980s, and the arrival of tens of thousands of young Irish into the United States, and they came up against the reality of illegality, their inability to, in the vast majority of cases, to settle here legally and obtain a green card. So from zero in 1968, we find ourselves with thousands in the 1980s, but not legal thousands. And of course, that was going to prompt, this time, would prompt action on the part of legislators in Washington.
Mm. It's interesting. I don't want to give away the book, but it was death by a thousand cuts for Judge Collins. There was even factions inside of one of our dear organizations that were running quite contrary because they had favorite legislators.
Mm.
So the problem with legislation is that people want to adopt it, but you have to be very specific about what you want and what the outcomes have to be. And I think that there was some ambivalence about outcomes. And there was many bills created between 1968 and 1974 that could have helped. And a lot of people said, look, this is the right way. And another person would say, actually, I'm a big shot in my state, and this is important to me. So I think that the thing that I learned from this and from the Irish immigration reform movement and Eiler was be specific. Let people know what your outcome has to be. And that will erase a lot of the ambivalence. It won't erase it all because you'll still have machinations in Congress that will be against you. And there's one little vignette in there where one of the actual leaders of one of the bills voted himself down. And everybody said, what are you, nuts? Well, he did it so that he could introduce the proper way for that bill to go forward in another form, another technical correction, and we got forward. Now, let's go towards the time when we had our great success. It was a time after President Reagan had offered amnesty to many people in the United States, but they had to be here by 1982.
Yeah.
And that's what you'll see in immigration. They'll put a deadline, a hard stop, so there's not a massive wave of people rushing to come into the country. In other words, it'll have already passed. So 1982 had already passed. And anybody that's alive, that's been here since then, can get this amnesty that Ronald Reagan, I mean, the the man that's looked at most as conservative America, president, also with Irish roots, Ballyporeen, County Tipperary. But what happened with the Irish? There was a difference with the Irish.
Well, what you see and what you notice. Um, After the 65 Act and the years after that, and you would say to Judge Collins or somebody, this is not such a big deal. Look around, there are loads of Irish, which there were already here. You didn't have to go far. The Irish were very prominent. Then you get into the 1980s and you're in Ireland. Um, uh, do you notice, in a general sense, that loads of people are leaving? Not necessarily. You tend to notice those who are still there and the issues of the day. I only was aware of the undocumented Irish when I moved here full time in 1987. And before I worked for the Irish Echo, I had worked for the Irish Press group of newspapers in Dublin for 7 years as a reporter. I don't think I ever once wrote a story about undocumented Irish in America, but I was hardly off the plane here when I found myself writing about the undocumented Irish because I very quickly became aware of them. I remember sitting on a bed in a subletted apartment in Brooklyn interviewing Congressman Roman Mazzoli on the phone. And I always joke about Mazzoli with a name like that. He sounds like he should be from Brooklyn, but he was actually from Kentucky. And I was learning something new myself about a new phenomenon, the undocumented Irish. And before, I think I was probably the first Irish born reporter in the US to actually start writing about this. And the Irish press was very receptive because the Irish press had basically 90% of its readership outside the Dublin metropolitan area. In other words, the countryside. In other words, the places where the kids were leaving. So they were very aware of this. So they gave it good, front page stuff. I remember it was a visit by Charlie Haughey at one point. He was going to come to Washington in triumph. And then the news broke of an INS raid, pre-ICE INS raid on a nursing home outside Boston that was staffed virtually entirely by young Irish women who were all undocumented. And literally the picture of a young girl from Cork or Mayo or somewhere running across the grass lawn in her nightdress, literally fleeing INS agents. And this was the front page. Charlie Haughey, I believe, was absolutely furious because he lands in Washington. He wants to see what's in the Irish press, which of course was founded by Eamon de Valera. He wants to see page one, and it's not about him arriving. It said as Charles Haughey arrived in Washington, here we are up in Boston with a young Irish woman fleeing into the night in her nightie, you know? So this was like, to me, was like, as a reporter, in a way, if you want to be cynical about it, it was like manna from heaven. But it was also a completely unfamiliar story to most people back in Ireland. And it was through that you began to get a reaction then among Irish politicians, and then you started to get a reaction among politicians here in the United States, Irish American politicians in particular. And then you had the Irish immigration reform movement, which of course was loud in its presence, as you know, as you were in it. Um, and this story went from kind of 0 to 100 miles an hour in about a year. Um, so it was an extraordinary story with incredible components and blessedly congressional action, as you know, which led to various sort of visa programs, Donnelly, Morrison in particular, and ultimately
Berman.
the Berman visas, and ultimately the Schumer visas that became diversity visas. So that this seems like a million years ago because this was a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth and members of Congress did things on immigration. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And it is a million years ago, or seems like it.
It's sad because to meet Brian Donnelly, so Massachusetts, his accent.
Dorchester.
And to know that the undocumented were overwhelming in Dorchester, in Woodlawn. Siobhan and I got involved because we were given bad advice by a lawyer that was recommended by an older Irish organization's immigration committee. And we said, jeepers, if we're getting bad information from one of the rooted organizations, there's a need. And we went to a meeting in the aforementioned Cork Association, and that's where we met the people that had a kitchen cabinet in Mayor Driscoll's kitchen, Sean Minahan and Pat Hurley and Father Matt and May and her brothers. And that was the formative days of the Irish immigration reform movement. And one of the first things that was agreed on was that they had to get good advice from lobbyists, from lawyers, and work on legislators. Now, the one thing that they weren't really worried about at the time was making an impact on the Irish government, because the Irish government was looking away from this. It would be pointing out their own inadequacies on immigration and migration and why people are leaving Ireland. But, I think that one of the reasons why that organization was successful was because it was allowed to flourish across the country, and people formed their own chapters of the Irish immigration reform movement, many of them Hibernians, because those cells of Hibernians, those silos of Irish organizations across the country, were people that were well versed in knowing their congressmen, knowing their legislators on a local level. There's no way that you can make access today on legislation unless you're dealing with a congressman and the person that's making appeal to them is known to them. It's absolutely impossible. So that's why we depend on a network. So, Ray, there was a bit of aggressiveness to the Irish immigration reform movement, particularly with Ireland, particularly with its message. Some of their messages, perhaps you'd like to share, some of their methodology, some of their sloganism. And
Well, I mean, they legalized the Irish. They were media savvy, within the technological limits of the time compared to today. They were iconoclastic in a way, because a lot of politicians, particularly in Ireland, were saying, "Oh," because I remember the time, the attitude that I was hearing was, "Look, don't make noise, don't make a fuss. If we keep it all quiet and under the table, we can look after these Irish. We'll get them jobs. Say nothing, blah blah blah." And that was a prevailing view within older established Irish America at the time that I came across myself. But the double IRM themselves were having none of that. They were not going to go silently into the night, if you will. They were going to make a racket. And there was the famous story, you mentioned Pat Hurley in the New York Times, Pat, the undocumented immigrant, and he was interviewed by the New York Times. So here was a face on everything. But a lot of people here, a lot of politicians, a lot of Irish Americans, a lot of people generally were kind of amazed that the Irish are illegal. They would say there was a lack of awareness of the realities uh, were handed down by the 65 Act, really. The fact that the Irish were undocumented or illegal, there is a distinction between the two categories, but that the Irish were somehow outside the pale was a major surprise to established Irish America, to Americans in general. And the double IRM was very effective in letting it be known that yes, we're in a different situation now, in a different category. And yes, the Irish can be outside the legal parameters of American life. It's not like the old days. So I think this came as a bit of a surprise, if not a shock, to many here. And the double IRM was persistent, and it didn't go away. After making, it as you say, it grew across the country, different chapters in different cities, lobbying various members of Congress who are probably surprised to hear about this. And so it was a new organization for a new age in its ability, because put it this way, the American Irish National Immigration Committee, it was only later on that I found out about them. But you would have wanted to be blindfolded with earplugs walking down the street, not to have known about the double IRM,
yeah,
whether you liked it or not. They were
even
in,
in the parade, even
yeah,
in the St.
they were in
Patrick's
the
Day
bring it,
parade.
yeah, while marching, making a fuss in the parade. They were in your face. with their situation. And this was because it was their situation. Many of the members were literally the people that the IIRM was campaigning about. So I suppose literally a classic grassroots organization.
You know, interestingly, a lot of the donors to the Irish immigration reform movement, I mean, I don't know if they were not for, I don't know if they had time to form a not-for-profit as they were doing legislation. A lot of them were businessmen who were undocumented themselves.
Mm.
And what a lot of people in this country don't understand is that some of these people were so busy being business people that they never even had the time to adjust their status. And many of the people today that are saying that it's time to close the doors on immigration, unfortunately, have forgotten what they came from. You know,
Yeah,
there's
a lot of the people you talk about there, I mean, during the 1990s when immigration changes brought in E-Verify, where an employer would have to verify the status of an employee. A lot of the Irish at the time were the actual contractors who themselves were charged to verify the legal status of their employees, even though they themselves were not fully legally in the United States. There's kind of an irony to it. No, I mean you always get that. I mean it's a natural thing. There's 10 people on the lifeboat on the Titanic, and then there's another half dozen wanting to get in the lifeboat, and the 10 people in the lifeboat are afraid that six more people is going to tip the thing over. And you get that in immigration a lot too. You know, the whole thing about don't let the door hit you on the way out type of thing. I've come across that over the years. Um, Older Irish immigrants would say to you, well, look, I went through all the legal loopholes. I did everything right and legally entered the country. Why are these people here? And I'd say, look, because you had the ability and the right to enter legally. It was made possible for you to enter legally. It is not being made possible for these people to enter legally. And you get a kind of sort of a half begrudging, well, okay, you know, but, so there was a misunderstanding. There was a gap between generations of Irish as well as between Irish immigrants and US legislation. But there was also these sort of synapses or gaps between generations here. And those who had come earlier and had come so legally couldn't quite understand. Took a bit of explaining at times. So it was like they were unaware of the 65 Act and its implications. They were here busy just getting on with their lives.
Yeah.
And now they had to be sort of, I suppose, educated in a way as to what the present reality was in the 1980s, 1990s, and into the noughties. So yeah, that's
Right.
always been a part of this story, is actually sort of informing and educating those who you would think would be automatically in your camp, but are
Don't
not.
ever take that for granted. When we went to
Never,
Ireland,
never take that for granted.
yeah, when we went to Ireland in the 90s, and then we're going to have to move into the 2000s and on after this. Siobhan's mother was involved with a come-in of Fianna Fáil and revealing family state secrets. And the access that we got to the ministers at that time was unbelievable. So whether it was Daly up in Clare or Noonan, the Minister of Defense, our vacation that year was spent visiting the ministers of state and the ministers of their various agencies. And the thing that was surprising was they didn't really know about how many undocumented. They knew in their own town how many people had left. They could comment on some of their GA teams not being as robust as they used to be. So all politics, as our friend Tip O'Neill said, is local. And I think that the message I keep trying to underline for the Hibernians is we need you. When we ask you to help, when there is legislation, you got to get involved because we can't do it ourselves. You know, Ray, Martin Galvin is on the webinar today, and he asked a question. He said, you know, you recently covered the death of one of the deportees, and he was a very dear friend and a member of the Hibernians. And you know, there's other members of the deportees, and they're still waiting for their dividend from being involved with the Good Friday Agreement, which led to peace in Ireland. I mean, this seems to be a very small group of people, and I know that our national president, Sean Pender, is very passionate about the fact that generationally, people that are the grandchildren of some of the people that were involved with armed conflict
Mm.
and struggle are now being denied visas. I mean, you are, as I say, one of our greatest witnesses of history. I mean, what say you, and what can we do to resolve these long-standing things? Irish undocumented, we know they're still there.
Hmm.
The Good Friday Agreement, no dividends for the deportees,
Mm.
and now a generation that's witnessing visa denial from the north of Ireland that shouldn't. What do you think?
Yeah, well, this is I suppose a story within a story, the deportees, and as you say, this extension of denial to the descendants of individuals who took part in the conflict in Northern Ireland. And Martin was obviously referring to Noel Gaynor. And it's a curious thing because you can coin the phrase in the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. And this is if you went to a legislator and say, look, in the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, can we not just lift the sword of Damocles that hangs over the deportees? Can we lift these restrictions on children and grandchildren of people just because they might share the same name? That would be a campaign, I think, in and of itself. Um, and but the thing is, these days, I mean, who do you go to in Congress? You'd have to sort of very carefully choose a list. It would have to be very deliberately bipartisan. You might be tempted to, in fact, go to members of the majority party first. Um, it's something that would have to be worked out probably fairly quietly too. Because as we know with the likes of the E3 visas, there's always politicians or some politician in Washington who will bring that sword down to stop what is basically a good idea. Um, this is why politicians, of course, slip in their favorite little things into massive bills that seem to have nothing to do with the massive bill. It's the age-old trick in Congress, and you might have to do something like that. The Northern Ireland Troubles Relief Bill might have to be slipped into um, the soybeans
Cotton
bill,
soybean
or
bill,
something
yeah.
like. Yeah, no, I mean this is and it's a terrible thing about politics here is that you cannot be honest about something in the sense you're always trying to slip something in. Well, why can't you just say, look, this is a good idea, for God's sake. Can we just vote on it separately? Take you 5 minutes. But unfortunately, and given the situation and the political culture and everything else, that is just extremely hard to do. Um, and the deportees have lived here under Democratic and Republican administrations, Democratic and Republican Congresses, and they are still the deportees. And the question is, you have to ask is why?
Mm.
Why? And I go back to the Gang of Eight bill. I know, are we in the 21st century? We're coming into McCain, Kennedy, and the Gang of Eight bill. I was looking at that today. I was just trying to remind myself of the Gang of Eight. Three of the Democrats in the Gang of Eight are still in the Senate. It's Schumer, Durbin, and Bennett. One of them is in jail, Bob Menendez. Of the four Republicans, John McCain sadly is no longer with us. Jeff Flake has left Congress. Marco Rubio is Secretary of State, and Lindsey Graham is the only one of the four. Um, so the Gang of Eight is now the Gang of Four. That legislation is still theoretically on the books.
You know what happened to the last Gang of Four?
Right, exactly. So no, and this is the frustrating thing. I think that something like the deportees would be an issue that could be solved with the stroke of an auto pen in the Oval Office, and it just they're here anyway. They have lived here for decades. They have been contributing members of society. They haven't done anybody harm. They have families. They have American children, for heaven's sake. I mean, it is very discouraging when you think about it as to why this is not a relatively small issue. It's not a minor issue. It's an important issue. But in terms of logistics, it is, you know, now I understand there may be similar individuals from other countries here, and this is sometimes we look through a prism, an Irish prism. Sometimes there may be people from other countries who are in a similar situation.
Sure, translators from Afghanistan have had difficulties staying in the country.
Yeah.
Ray, I noticed that we don't have a lot of time left. And one of the things that I did want to touch upon is the support that is unique for the Irish in America. First of all, I think that those of us on this call, in front of you folks, know that the immigrant support program of Ireland is unique in its support for its diaspora. And one of its main beneficiaries of that support has been the Irish immigration centers. Now, to think about that, in the United States, a melting pot with 248 nations represented usually in its citizenship, we have Irish immigration centers. They're called the Coalition of Immigration Centers. There's a Irish pastoral centers that are represented by Irish priests, and there has been since the 80s. And then you get the centers themselves. And that's one of the things that we always ask everybody is to remember those centers in when they want to be beneficial, when they want to support. If a division wants to look for a charity, I think one of the first things they should look at is the immigration centers. In the last few years, they've become so important, including during the time of the Eiler move for the E3 visa. I mean, the data that came to us was not often coming from government. It was coming from actual cities and their knowledge of the Irish community and the immigrant community. And the data we got, people like John Stoll from the Emerald Isle Immigration Center, and Siobhan Dennehy, who runs that center, and the centers across the country. How important are they to what we need to do?
Yeah, absolutely vital. I mean, you have this startling contrast, I suppose, between a population of people living outside the structures, the legal structures of their host nation. And then you have this very organized structure, the centers, the various immigration and pastoral centers, stand in sharp contrast to this. You have this sort of very solid basis of support that wasn't in existence, certainly back in the double IRM days, really, until the founding of initially the Emerald Isle Immigration Center and then others. So it's a bit of a glaring contrast because you have these structures, these organizations and entities supported by a now much more aware Irish government, succeeding Irish governments, and in some cases the host cities, the host American cities. So, what it does is underline and emphasizes the belief in the community that the undocumented Irish are important to the community. If they weren't important, the centres wouldn't exist. The existence of the centres underlines the belief that these people who are living outside legal status are in fact important to our community and important to the broader United States community. If you didn't believe that, you wouldn't have the centres. If you didn't believe that, you wouldn't have the immigrant support program from Dublin. If you didn't believe that, you wouldn't have cities like New York and Boston giving money to centres. And if you didn't believe that, you wouldn't have the likes of the ancient order Hibernian stepping up and out and saying, we need change. So I think it's an emphasis. You've got to stand up and show that, put your money where your mouth is what it is. And that's what it is. And, then you say, well, you have to take it seriously because we are putting our money where our mouth is. We believe in something here and we're not fools. And you really need to get on board and help us.
Well, we've touched on a lot of the topics covered in the book. I do want to say that, Ray, you've what makes this book so interesting is that you cover the human element. In every facet of U.S. history, you have given a little biography about soldiers, legislators, Annie Moore, and her hidden history and her newfound history, and people like our good friend Brian Anderson, the former chief of records. The work that was done by Irish people to always remember their predecessors, and the work of the Irish at any time to think of their successors, to think of the future.
Mm-hmm.
And this book, I can't recommend it enough. For those of you that don't want to read anymore, it's on Audible. It's $10. I mean, now the mispronunciations in that are legion because it's done by auto tune. So, but I think what it's going to do is it's going to spark an understanding. It's going to bring people to a better understanding. And the other thing is, I asked Chris Cook from the National Board to put the white paper on that we created several years ago. It gives a nice history of and data and statistics of the AOH's work on immigration and ways to go forward. Now, that's a living document, just like our Constitution. It's not going to remain in that form, and it will be updated as we go forward. But between this book, Ray, and your original book, you have one more in you, don't you? And
well, it's the accidental. I'm calling it the accidental trilogy. Yeah, the first one was the New Irish Americans, 1998. This one, 2021, Unintended Consequences. You sometimes worry. You write it. It's basically a history book in a way, and you worry that And I said, what if the day after publication, Congress suddenly passes a massive immigration reform bill and gives visas to all the Irish? I said, this thing's going to be hanging on the wall as a museum piece. The sad thing is that this was published in April 2021. Nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is things have got worse,
And I have less hair.
That's an extraordinary thing. I wrote a story about that. I said that nothing has changed, and that's not a good thing. So I almost wish this book to be outdated, and it isn't. It could have been published yesterday. The third one you mentioned, by the way, there are two chapters in Unintended Consequences. You mentioned Annie Moore. The other one about Kennedy's funeral and the Irish Army cadets. Those are two chapters that were deliberately so inserted as a kind of an emotional lift. They're not necessarily to do with the subject matter, but they're supposed to underline, emphasize the closeness of Ireland and the United States, the emotional links that are just massive. I tried to make this book, it could be all about legislation, but I tried to make it broad-based and readable. So the third one, E Pluribus Aeon, which I've started. E Pluribus Unum, the motto, out of many one. Aeon, AON, is the Irish for one. And it'll be a treatment of every American president from George Washington to Donald Trump, or if it takes me that long, whoever follows Trump, and Ireland, and all their respective actions vis-a-vis Ireland, their relationships or lack thereof, their actions, their lack of actions, their connections, their lack of connections. So it's a broad-based thing. All the presidents. It will bring in the Irish American presidential forums, John Deary and his efforts and leading up to Bill Clinton and all the rest of it and what has followed Bill Clinton. So this would be a third book. And I suppose then the three would become a kind of accidental trilogy.
Well, Ray, for myself, I can't thank you enough for joining us on this fair Saturday morning. And the same goes to everybody that's viewing. Worthy President, do you have any closing words for us?
I want to thank you, Dan, very much for facilitating this, and Ray. And again, I think the chapter about the funeral was very moving, and how I believe you tracked down some of these people, and of course how they can remember the fact that they were whisked over to the U.S. only days after the president was assassinated, and performed at the burial. Was very moving. I thought also, the timeline that you put in there was what jumped out to me also. Okay, post 65 we had this, but then what happened after that? Well, then the troubles became more,
Mm.
front and center. And in a way, that took all the political interest
Attention.
away from the immigration
Yeah.
to that. So it was interesting. And one of the things you quoted in there was that there's no new ideas when it comes to immigration. It's like the same issues over and over again, and tying in a lot of it. And I believe during the Cleveland administration, when they were pushing to hardcore immigration, he said not too long ago, those people that we're saying the same thing about, they are now our best citizens. And that was
Mm.
one of the things that really jumped out to me. So, like I said, Dan and I both can't recommend this book more. And again, it's a great history of the Irish experience in America, and where we are now. And a very good friend of mine, a hero of mine, Clara O'Reilly, used to always said, the Irish are no better than anybody else, but by God, we're no worse. And it seems like because of probably a little lack of knowledge or understanding of the far-reaching effects of 1965, we've been stuck with this for so long. For 65, I can't believe it. It's almost 60 years ago, and now we are coming up against a lack of action. Yes, there's been some successes with the Donnelly and the Morrison visas, and we will be forever grateful to those men and to those who supported those. But going forward, I think it's only right that something has to be done to right this wrong. But it is unfortunate, like you say, right, in the landscape we're in. It seems the job of Congress is to get things not done than done. But I think if we took a look, and if in my own personal opinion, if that Gang of Eight had passed all those years ago, I think we would be in an entirely better place in this country, from a security side, and also getting past this and let the people come out of the shadows who have contributed to that, and get rid of the people who shouldn't be here. So aspirational, absolutely. But I think this book, like you said, in closing, the fact that since it's been gone 4 years now and nothing has done, tells you that we need to get something done. So I'll turn it back to Ray and Dan if you want to have any closing thoughts before we sign off.
Ray?
Well, I mean, thank you, Sean. You mentioned the Gang of Eight bill. The very first two words in that bill were border security, followed by economic opportunity, followed by immigrant modernization of immigration law. But the very first thing. So it wasn't some sort of wild, out of control, let them all in bill. It was a bill based first and foremost on border security, and it was passed by the Senate and it died in the House. And this is really, in my view, the problems that we're facing today are in large part due to the fact that Congress hasn't grasped this nettle and actually brought about sensible, comprehensive immigration reform that, yes, would secure the borders, yes, would bring order to admissions, but also recognizing the fact that millions of people who have worked hard, tried to be their very best to be American and lived here within the law should be allowed to do so. But that hasn't happened, and there's no particular sign of it happening now, and probably for some years to come. So we're going to be, if we do this again in a couple of years, we're probably going to be talking about much the same thing, unfortunately.
I hear echoes of Brendan Moore at a state board meeting behind me. The 12 o'clock fire bell is going off. But one thing I wanted to say is that the most important document that we have right now for everything that we do is the Irish Echo. And Ray O'Hanlon, you are the great fulfiller of that role as the editor of the Irish Echo. And those of us that can remember your predecessor, John Jack Thornton, would know that right now he's smiling down on these faces because he knows that his paper is in good hands. But the most important thing about that is that the people here have to read that paper. Go to irishecho.com and subscribe to the paper, because if there's going to be an AOH and it's going to have a message, we're going to need it in Irish Echo. So I'm counting on everybody to buy the book, subscribe to the Echo, support the immigration department, and be the best advocates that we have for all of those things by being a Hibernian and by being somebody that's aware of the situation. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, everybody, for watching today. looking forward to the next opportunity to speak to everyone. And again, best of luck, Ray, with your new endeavor.
And thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us today. This webinar will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after the fact, and I want to thank Chris Cook for always helping out and making this happen. So to all, have a great day, and thanks for joining the Ancient Order Hibernians webinar.